Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the Clinton Presidential Center. I'm Stephanie Street, and I serve as Executive Director of the Clinton Foundation. Tonight, we are celebrating the opening of not one, but two wonderful new temporary exhibits. Although these two exhibits are separate and unique, they both pay tribute to the life and the legacy of Elvis Presley. Elvis at 21, Photographs by Alfred Wertheimer, is a beautiful series of 56 black and white images of Elvis captured by our guest of honor, world-renowned photographer Alfred Wertheimer. We are very privileged to have him with us in Little Rock tonight, and we'll look forward to his presentation in just a few moments. Elvis at 21 will run through August 21st and is presented in partnership with the Smithsonian Institution. We're also thrilled to present the second half of our summer blockbusters, an exhibit simply entitled Elvis. The Clinton Center and Graceland have worked together to present a collection of artwork, photographs, and memorabilia that pay tribute to the king of rock and roll. Elvis is presented in partnership with Elvis Presley Enterprises and Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee, and will be on display through September 11th. We're also honored to have several special guests from Graceland with us this evening: Angie Marchese, Alicia Dean, Scott Williams, Michelle Williams, and Kevin Kern. Thank you all so much. Please stand up so we can recognize you. Again, we are so grateful for you all allowing us to present this tremendous exhibit here at the Clinton Center. Elvis also includes painting from the amazing pop artist Peter Mars. Peter's unique style is a fusion of what he describes as falling somewhere between that area where nonsense and popular culture so frequently meet. Peter's artwork gives us the opportunity to view one of the greatest cultural icons of all time, Elvis Presley, through a distinctive lens of avant-garde and pop art. We're so fortunate to have Peter with us tonight, all the way from Chicago, along with his colleagues Bob Chase, Mike Harden, and his wife Sandra. Can you all stand and let us recognize you as well? Peter, welcome again to Little Rock, and thank you for sharing your take on the King of Rock and Roll. I'd also like to extend a personal thank you to the Clinton Foundation's Manager of Development and Communications, Ms. Joy Sakubin, who has worked tirelessly these last few months to bring together this one-of-a-kind exhibit. Where's Joy? We need to recognize Joy. Is she in here? Thank you, Joy, so much. And it's also my privilege, I believe, to recognize Barbara Pryor, our former First Lady of Arkansas, who's in the audience this evening. Mrs. Pryor, it's always an honor to have you with us as well. In President Clinton's autobiography, My Life, he describes his appreciation for Elvis. He says, beyond his music, I identified with his small-town Southern roots, and I thought he had a good heart. I hope you'll take time to see the exhibits tonight and invite your family and friends to come back and enjoy them both. Now, we are going to travel back to 1956, back to a time before the King's coronation, back to a time when a 26-year-old freelance photographer was assigned to photograph an up-and-coming musician, back to a time when many people, including this photographer, may have asked, Elvis who? After Mr. Wertheimer's presentation, we'll leave time for questions from the audience. Now, please join me in welcoming to the Clinton Center, Mr. Alfred Wertheimer.
Thank you. Hi there. I guess this is the biggest crowd I've ever faced. But I'll try, I'll do my best. Well, you've been told my name is Alfred Wertheimer, and it's always been that. Oh, this is tricky. If I list over to the right side, I've got two radio mics on me here. I hope we don't get feedback. But at any rate, oh, that's bad. Let me see. You'll excuse me. All right, I won't use this. Can you hear me back there? You can't. All right. Can anybody do something about feedback? All right, I'll just stand a little further back. See, normally I do this with the dog and pony show where we actually go into the exhibit and then I'll have 30 or 40 people around and we'll go from photograph to photograph and it becomes very intimate that way. This is the first time we've tried it with a slideshow, essentially, where we're clicking ahead one picture at a time and with a large image. So now, let me just jump ahead. At one point, I was young. Now I'm older. And you don't know where the years go. They just come and they disappear. I met this 18-year-old young man today. He says, I'm 18. I said, well, I also have an 8 and a 1 in my life, only it's reversed. And so then I said, but Al, when are you going to get a life, you know? So when I was younger, and I started first getting involved with photography at around the age of 17. My brother Henry gave me a Prontor S camera, which is one of those folding kind of cameras where you look down, and it's a simple $35 camera in those days. And I was fascinated by it. Even though I had gone to, eventually I wound up going to a school called Cooper Union, which was for art and engineering and architecture. And there, I was doing mostly advertising design, a little bit of sculpture, a little bit of graphic arts, a little bit of etching, a little bit of lettering, a little bit of everything, just so you get your feet wet in the art world. But still, I kept coming back to the camera, and there was a teacher there by the name of Breitenbach from Europe. Incidentally, I'm also from Europe. I was born in Germany in 1929. I won't tell you how old I am. But at the age of 6, we emigrated to this country thanks to the Nazi regime. We decided not to stay there. It wasn't too healthy for us. So my mother had an uncle who was big in the patent leather business. Now, maybe some of you know the patent leather business, but luckily he was quite rich and he was willing to take a chance of having a bunch of refugees come over and back us if we ever needed anything, which we never did. So here I wind up eventually in Brooklyn, New York, go to school there, grow up, and I'm beginning to learn what life is all about. And once I graduated from Cooper Union, it was a question of, do I go in the Army? Because in those days there was draft. Or do I look around to become a professional something, to earn a living? Well, the draft got me. Before I knew it, instead of, it wound up getting me to a place called Fort Dix, New Jersey. And there were about 200 of us wise guys from New York who knew it all. And the captain there said, now we're going to make men out of you. And I was thinking about photography. Architects were thinking about architecture and so on. And he said, no, your job is to engage the enemy and to destroy them. Well, that was news to us. This was during the Korean War. So one of the fellows said, but I have no enemy, Captain. He says, your country's enemy is your enemy, so get that through your head. Anyway, I wound up being a mortar base plate carrier. That was my MOS, which is an acronym in the Army for what you do for the rest of your career there. And we had, draft was about 2 years. And, but I didn't like that too much, because these things weighed about 55 pounds. And I was determined to do a documentary, still photograph story about what you go through when you become a recruit and eventually you finish your basic training and you're a soldier. So I carried my Leica and a Contax camera around my neck. Very dumb thing to do, because you never want to buy two camera bodies from two different manufacturers because then the lenses don't interchange. But what did I know? I knew nothing. I was feeling my way. And so I did the best I could. And then after 14 weeks of the 16 weeks of the basic training, I went back to New York to the Village Camera Club, which I was still a member. And since I was officially a night person, I would get up when the sun went down, and I'd go to bed when the sun came up. So I would go to Village Camera Club, and I would use their dark room since nobody else would work at night. And I had it all to myself, and I could do all the printing and developing and what have you. And I put together a quite beautiful folio for the captain, and I gave it to him. And he said, "Private Wertheimer, this is a fine job. I've never seen anything like it." And this is when I was, this was 1954. Yes, 54. "Could you make another one for the general of the base?" I said, "Tell you what I'm going to do, Captain. What do you say you get me another MOS as an Army photographer?" So he said, "Well, I can't promise that, Private. However, if anybody can do it, the general can do it." So I took my chances. I was a bit of a hustler myself. So I went back to New York, put together another folio. He gave it to the general. Long story short, MOS got changed. Now officially, I was no longer a mortar base plate carrier. I was an Army photographer. Hallelujah. So now, instead of shipping me to California, which meant you go to Korea, they said, "You stick around with 8 or 9 others, and you will know where you're going when we post your serial number on the bulletin board." And you wait, and you wait, and you wait. A few days go by. Eventually, some of us go to Alaska, others to Greenland, others to Iceland. Where do I go? Right where I left Germany. So I'm now in occupied Germany to become an Army photographer. And they ship me from Bremerhaven in the north all the way down to the Swiss border. And then you wait and wait and wait, and one day you wind up in an all-Southern engineering group near what is known as Schwetzingen, which is in the heart of Germany, near Heidelberg. So I figure, well, this is an adventure in life, and this is what you do when you become a photographer. So they ship me there, and the master sergeant says, "Wertheimer, do you drive a Jeep?" I said, "But where's the photo equipment?" So he said, "Well, we don't have any." I said, "But I was shipped here to be the photographer for this unit." He said, "Well, we'll get it in. Don't worry about it. We're going to teach you how to drive a Jeep." So they teach you the Jeep. After the Jeep came the deuce-and-a-half truck. After the truck came the bulldozers. So now I was a bulldozer operator. And the reason they would not dismiss me is because the more bodies you had in your unit, the more supplies you got in. The more supplies you got in, the more power you had. So now I was a pawn in this game that was being played. And I went along with it because I had no choice. And besides which, I enjoyed riding on a bulldozer. It was real power. You have all these levers, sticks, the shovel goes up, it goes down, you move dirt, and there it goes, and there you are. And so one day I met a fellow photographer from a small unit near Heidelberg who had a major as the head of the group. And he said, "You know, Al, if you could get yourself transferred over to our unit, you could be a photographer. We need one." We were doing the local newspaper. So we managed to get the major to write a letter to the captain to release me from this one unit to the other unit for the good of the Army and the good of the country, and therefore I got transferred. And you can't predict how these things wind up. It's just fate. So now I'm in this small unit of maybe 13 people, run by basically a bunch of whacks, not wacky people, but Women's Army Corps. And they had their way of doing things, and I had my way of doing things. But I lost out because they were determined to do it the Army way, which was by the book, which meant no small negatives, no small cameras. You get a speed graphic, which is a big camera that Ouija used to use. It's what the press photographers would use. It had a 4x5 negative. I'm just getting a little technical here. And I said, but it's so restrictive. The smaller camera allows for bigger lenses, darker imagery. You could get to do available light material. You don't have to use big flash bulbs. No, we won't hear of it. You do that, Wertheimer, you're out of here. Now, they didn't tell me why I would be out of here, but they were determined. And so I later on found out what they had in mind, and it made perfect sense once I understood that. So you would go and take a photograph of a senator meeting a general about a housing plan for the dependent Americans in Germany. And you would line them up like an illustration, and it would wind up in the newspaper the next week or the next day. And then you would have to go around and get from left to right the name of the person, spelling it correctly, who they were, identification of all kinds. And we had this German tank commander by the name of Birki, who was taken as a Russian prisoner of war after World War II, and he was lucky enough to survive Siberia. And the Army hired him because they didn't trust us to develop the film. So Birki, the former Nazi, was the teacher of this fella here, how to develop film. And he was very good. And he showed us what to do. So once you got the 4x5, you had to take a crow quill pen and dip it in India ink and write those captions right on the bottom of all those negatives in very fine script so that the captions were married now to the negative forever. And for all I know, somewhere in the Pentagon, there's some of my Army photographs that are still there with my handwriting of left to right, General so-and-so, and so-and-so. So that got me disciplined, at least to caption writing, getting information. Well, we move a little forward. Now I'm out of the Army. I'm working for a fashion photographer by the name of Tom Palumbo, who's working for Alexei Brodovich, a very well-known art director for Harper's Bazaar. And I'm so good at what I do, I take care of his printing, I take care of his dark room, I take care of setting up the studio. I'm in charge of his record collection so he can get the models into good mood. And I'm in charge of the fan that blows the fabric while the models are doing their thing. I'm in charge of the Coke bottle that goes into the back of their belts to tighten up and cinch their waist. I'm in charge of all that. But when it comes to going down to the Caribbean on a nice, juicy assignment, and I was hoping to travel and learn about the world, he says, Al, you're too invaluable. I was getting $60 a week, which wasn't too good a pay, but it was enough to get by. You're going to have to stay here and supply the needs to the magazines, and I'll be back in 2 weeks. Well, I didn't like that. And so I was determined to leave when he got back. But before I leave, I'd have to learn about the 8x10 cameras. He was using large cameras, and the large camera format is entirely different from the small camera format. And you had to be very disciplined. You had almost no latitude. Everything was on a tripod. Well, I got everything very sharp, but it was dull, boring, and it was uninspiring. So I decided I better stick to my knitting. I liked people. I was good with people. And I was good with the spontaneous events, and I was good with available photography, available light photography. So I quit. And now I was unemployed. But I now met 3 or 4 other photographers at Dave Linton's studio. I'm getting to Elvis very shortly. And so now I'm at Dave Linton's studio. It's a cooperative. We pay the rent to Dave, $75 a month. And we get to share the darkroom, the studio, and the facilities. And Paul Schutzer, I have to mention his name because without Paul I wouldn't be here today. Paul Schutzer was anxious to become a Life magazine photographer. I met him first at Cooper Union. He was there for about a year. His father and brothers were both lawyers, and they wanted him to be a lawyer, but no, he wanted to be a journalist. And And so he would do a lot of freelance work for life. And he said, Al, I think you should go see Ann Fulchino at RCA Victor with your portfolio. Because if a call comes in from Life and from Ann, I'm going to take the Life assignment. And that's a shame that we should lose the job. Why don't you go down? And he eventually became a Life photographer. Unfortunately for Paul, who happened to want to be right up front during the Six-Day War in Israel, between Egypt and Israel, he got himself killed at that point. But that was a sad personal thing for me, because we were going to set up a movie studio together. But at any rate, I went to see Ann Fulchino, and on March 10th, she called me and said, Al, what are you doing on the 17th of March? I said, well, for you, Ann, I'm available. What's up? I'm available for anybody. I needed the job. So she says, I'd like you to photograph the Tommy Jimmy Dorsey stage show for on CBS that was produced by Jackie Gleason. And I said, Tommy Dorsey? Well, I like Tommy Dorsey's work, and Harry James, Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Mozart, Beethoven, that's my kind of music. So she said, no. If they're in the picture, that's fine, but I want you to photograph Elvis Presley. Then there was that obvious silence for about 10 seconds. And I said, Elvis who? And it was Elvis Presley. Well, who is Elvis Presley? Well, Elvis Presley was signed by RCA, the record company, from Sun Records back in November of '55. And we don't have a thing in our files of photographs of Elvis, and we need them for publicity handouts, back of album jackets, and so on. So I said, well, for you, Ann, I'll be down, sure. So I go down to Studio 50, which is a studio that was converted from being a theater to a television studio in those days when television was becoming important. And they built out the stage by ripping out some of the seats in the orchestra and for the cameras to roll back. And Ann meets me at the stage door, takes me in hand, and we come to a dressing room. And she says to the two men who are in that dressing room, one a younger man, one an older man, middle-aged man. I was in between the two ages of the two men. Elvis, pointing to the younger man, he's got his Argyle socks, his foot up on the table, and he's looking at a left hand, and he's not paying attention to us at all. And she said, Elvis, I'd like you to meet Al Wertheimer. He's a photographer. I'd like him to take some photographs of you. Is that okay? And Elvis basically grunts, sure, why not? But he didn't even get up, say hello, shake my hand. It's great to see you. Welcome aboard. No, he's busy with his hand. And so I'm beginning to be the fly on the wall, which was fine with me. And I begin to take out my two Nikon split rangefinder cameras, black, so I could disappear behind them. And one with a 105 millimeter lens, the other one with a 35 millimeter lens, with my Tri-X film, which is pushed to 400. Now you've got all the technical details. And I start to photograph him and the ring salesman, who happened to be there to deliver the ring that Elvis had ordered a little while earlier. Now, this picture has nothing to do with the ring salesman. That's just an introduction to how I got to Elvis, through Ann Fulchino, through Paul Schutz, et cetera, et cetera. It was pure luck. Ann could have called any one of 5 other people that were on her short list of photographers, but I happened to be the one on the next line, and that's how I am getting to be here instead of somewhere else. Otherwise, all this 55-year assignment would never have happened. I mean, it's the longest assignment of my life because it happened in '56. Then it continued a little bit into 1958, and then after 1958, I never saw Elvis again. This was the time he had left from the Brooklyn port of embarkation in the Army. He now had a crew cut. He had his sideburns shaved off. he was now being used by the Army as a recruiting magnet with posters behind him. He was talking to at least 250 media people at the dock. The colonel had arranged to have autographed pictures of him so that as the boat pulled out into the harbor, he could flutter them down to the lower decks and his fans could have them. Most of them wound up in the water. And the colonel was foresighted enough to think ahead so that instead of John Philip Sousa music of the ship leaving New York Harbor for Bremerhaven, Germany, they would be playing Tutti Frutti, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, and all of the Elvis Sun records because the colonel could think 3 steps ahead while most others of us can only think 1 or 2 steps ahead. That was the forte of the colonel. You might not have liked his way of doing things, but he knew what he was doing. So then Elvis disappears, goes and meets Priscilla a year later. She's 14 years old, and that's a whole nother story that I'm not involved with. Now, we're going to move these pictures along. I wish there were a little more contrast to them, but we have to live with the technology that they give us. And so here, I'm just going to give you little captions to what the photographs are. This is, I call this picture Going Home. It's quite popular. Some say it's iconic. It was actually taken from the chest. I was sitting opposite Elvis on the Southern Railroad. We were heading back to Memphis. We were about 2 or 3 hours out of Memphis. He's got not a clarinet on his legs. He's got a couple of magazines and an Archie comic book, Archie and Veronica comic book. And he's kind of thinking about the Milk Fund Rustwood Stadium concert that night. This is now 4th of July, 1956. And I always tend to think, as when you read about Rembrandt, he always has like one view that the eye is towards the world and one view where the eye is towards your inner self. And I sense a certain tension between that eye in the dark part of his face where he's looking out into the world and the other part of him that he's covering up, even though he was just covering himself from the light that was coming in through the window. This is on a train. Now let's move ahead. Let's see if this works. Ah, it works. Here we are. Let me see. Yes, we are. All right. Here we are entering the Warwick Hotel. This is between the early rehearsal of the Tommy Jimmy Dorsey show. We're back in March 17th of 56. And in those days, they did not yet have the invention of videotape, if you can imagine. And when they had a show in, can I move out here a little bit? Can you hear me or you can't hear me? Well, when they did a show in New York, it was 5 o'clock California time. So people on the freeway. So they had to invent something. It was called videotape, and Ampex was the first to invent 2-inch videotape, and the whole point of the tape was to transfer time from the East Coast to the West Coast. So that now people on the West Coast could see these East Coast produced shows at a decent hour, and the East Coast people could see the West Coast television programs that were produced at a convenient time. And what they needed was an airplane to fly these big, heavy tapes from one end of the country to the other so that it could be more convenient. Now, Elvis is going back to the Warwick Hotel to freshen up, and then he'd have to go back to the studio to do his 6 minutes on air. Here is entering his room. Oops, we moved ahead two paces. So then when we got there was an envelope on the sofa, and it contained some fan mail. And so he and I were in the room alone, and if you notice, when you go to the show and actually look at the photographs, you'll notice there are 3-cent stamps on these envelopes. So that was first-class mail back in '56. And if you look close, he's got his good luck horseshoe diamond gold ring on his left hand, this finger here. He's got also a Speidel watch band and a watch. Later on, he jumps into the water, into the pool at home with his watch and gets his mother to dry it off for him. Now, we're moving ahead. Elvis, oops, why does it go to two things? Elvis finally is tired, and he falls asleep on his fan mail. And if you look in the foreground here, you'll see a lot of little torn up pieces of paper, which are his mail that he tore up into little shreds. And I'm asking him, why are you doing this, Elvis? People are writing you. Don't you keep it? He says, no, Al, I can't keep it. I don't have any assistants at this point in his life. He didn't even have a gold record at this point in his life. And he was basically a well-known regional singer. He had done very well with the Hank Snow Jamboree. Hank Snow is a singer out of Canada. And he actually closed the show for Hank Snow. And the Colonel Tom Parker, who wasn't a colonel and wasn't known as, whose name wasn't Parker, this is all made up, and that didn't come out for years later, he was Hank Snow's publicity and promotion man. And then when RCA decided to buy Elvis's contract from Sun Records, Colonel Parker put himself in a position where he became the personal manager of Elvis Presley, and Hank Snow thought he was the partner of the Colonel. And the first stage costumes and such were paid for by Hank Snow. So he thought, well, I'm in on this. Well, it turned out he wasn't in on it. And so then the Colonel devoted himself exclusively to being the manager of Elvis Presley. So now, let's see where we go to. All right, we're back in the rehearsal period of the stage show, and you see that knot on Elvis's strap. Well, Elvis broke his guitar strap. It was a leather strap, and Scotty Moore is behind Elvis, and DJ Fontana, the drummer, he's always hidden, and Bill Black, he's also hidden. So that's what happens when you're behind the main man. So I call this picture A-frame, because it just reminds me of an A. And so Elvis broke his strap, and he asked some of the fellas to go out and find him another guitar strap in all of New York. They couldn't find one. So they went to a grocery store and bought a clothesline. And so Elvis tied the clothesline with a knot and went on national television with his clothesline guitar strap. Now, the next time he went out, he had an actual guitar strap. So it didn't bother him. He just was so full of himself and so full of energy. This picture is called Four Fingers. It's during the actual take. I'm down in the orchestra pit. And originally it was called Four Fingers and a Toe. But my niece, who knows more about these things than I do, she works for Sheryl Crow. She's a sort of part of the management team. She said, Al, it's too complicated. Call it Four Fingers. All right, so it became Four Fingers. So now we are, and here, this one I said, this one is called Jump for Joy. So she said, no, wrong again. Just call it Jump. So she is simplifying my life. You see how women control the way you think? So Elvis would not be jumping during a rehearsal, but he would jump during an actual take on public air. So here we go. Oh, and then during the rehearsal, he'd be bored. You notice it says Studio 50. That was the CBS Studio 50. And it was a very cold day, and it almost looked like it could have taken place in Moscow. Everybody was so bundled up. But he was bored backstage, so he would come out, and every once in a while there'd be a few fans there, and they'd encourage him. And then he'd go back in, and he was waiting to rehearse. Finally, he did get rehearsed, and then we wound up at the Warwick Hotel. Now, of course, one of the things that Elvis was accused of was that Elvis had a pelvis. And they accused him of being Elvis the pelvis, and he didn't like that. So I wanted to show that Elvis did have a pelvis, and here he's walking out of the Richmond train station with the script of the Steve Allen show under his one arm, and then he had his boom box in the other arm. It was a small RCA transistor 7 radio, worked off 6 batteries, and he loved to blast it and see the reaction he could get from whoever happened to pass him by, especially old ladies in the lobby of hotels. And he would totally ignore them. He was always testing people. And the script essentially was written by Steve Allen, and it was essentially done to contain Elvis, because 2 or 3 weeks earlier on the Milton Berle show, he carried on in such a way singing Hound Dog that he got a lot of people in the South upset, most of which were Baptist ministers, who said he is a disciple of the devil and his work should be destroyed and have nothing to do with him, because he was bumping and grinding to a microphone stand like a burlesque queen. And Berle was encouraging all of this. Of course, Berle didn't have to pay the price. Elvis had to pay the price. So 2 weeks later, when he's on the Steve Allen show, and it's already booked, Steve is introducing Elvis as the new Elvis Presley. Well, he just was introduced to the American public in January, and now he was already the new Elvis Presley. So he was now contained by wearing a tuxedo, with a blue shirt, blue tie, and a top hat, which he never wore. But the only thing that Steve Allen allowed him to do was to wear some blue suede shoes, which was okay. And Elvis was now going to sing to a hound dog wearing a little hat on a pedestal, so he couldn't move. They were terrified of Elvis from the waist down. They loved him from the waist up, but not from the waist down. It was the grown-ups, not the kids. The kids loved him no matter what he did. And Elvis, in interviews, would say, I don't sing with my voice, I sing with my whole body. And therefore, I need to move. And they didn't seem to understand that, because Frank Sinatra moved just his hands. Mario Lanza moved just his hands. And whoever were the crooners of the day, they just moved their hands. But that wasn't Elvis. So now, he's now carrying that script written by Steve Allen, and this was going to be his first television acting role. Up to that point, on all these other shows, the 6 shows of the Dorsey brothers, the 2 of the Berle shows, he was Elvis the singer, and he would do 2 or 3 songs, and that was it. But now he's going to get involved with acting. So the script was about Tumbleweed Presley, Elvis, in a script called Range Roundup. And he was a cowboy, and he had a 6-shooter. He was dressed up like a cowboy with a cowboy hat. Everybody had cowboy outfit. Imogene Coca, Sid Caesar's sidekick, played one of the roles. And Andy Griffith, who's still with us, he played another role. So the 4 of them were doing Range Roundup. And the punchline of all this was that Elvis would pull out his revolver. Oh, what am I got here? He would pull out his revolver and at a full gallop shoot a Tonto bar, being dragged across the stage, and that would be the laugh. That would be the punchline. Now, I've been told I've got 5 minutes left, so we're going to be going through this at great speed. Elvis is gawking from the back of a taxi cab in Richmond, Virginia. He's got his transistor radio with him there. Now, the story here is, gentlemen, what would you like? Elvis would like the girl. Junior would like some food. This is lunch. This is lunch at the Jefferson Hotel restaurant. 5 minutes later, Elvis had his arms around the girl, and she loved it. Now here, this is one of my favorite pictures, very popular, especially with the New York Times readers. It's the most popular picture that I sell. and it's not cheap either. Except the name of the picture is grilled cheese 20 cents. See, those were the prices in those days. I just got 2 shots of it. One, this is the better one of the 2, and then they moved. Now here, we're in the green room at the Mosque Theater, and there's so much noise coming in from the ramp where the girls are screaming, Elvis, Elvis, Elvis. And he goes to the window, he says, girls, we're rehearsing. Jordanaires are trying to hear what we're singing. We need it for the show. Be quiet. And they were quiet. He was able to get them to be quiet. Now, then I was up in the bathroom photographing the Jordanaires and Elvis combing his hair, because the bathroom was a dressing room. And this was above the stage. And like a fool, I photographed the Jordanaires. And then Elvis disappears on me. And I'm chastising myself. How can you let the main personality in your story leave you? Go find Elvis. So here I am, my first year in photography, officially. And I come down the fire stairs here, and I see these 2 lovebirds at the end of this long tunnel, light coming through. And she's quite small. She's on her tippy toes. Elvis is 6 foot. So I take the, oh, what's going on here? And I say, I've got to get closer. Robert Capa, who unfortunately stepped on a landmine in Indochina, seems like all the people I knew stepped on terrible things. They died in war. But he said once, he was a famous photographer, he said once, if your pictures are boring and uninteresting, get closer. And if they're still boring, get even closer. Because as you get closer, you gain texture. And when you gain texture, you're gaining important information. And one of the questions that usually asked of me is, why did I stick with the Elvis story besides just New York? I wanted to get the rounded out feeling of what this man was about, because I was going to try to sell some stories to magazines. And therefore, I knew he would permit closeness. I mean, he didn't permit being 5, 6 feet away. He permitted being 3 feet away. Now, when you look at somebody from 3 feet, you see detail. When you look at somebody from 6 feet, you don't see such, and when you look at somebody from 15 feet away, it's just nothing. You know, you don't, I mean, you see the silhouette. So now, not only did he permit closeness, but he made the girls cry. Very important. If you find an entertainer who can make the girls cry, you've got a winner. Because you can always make them jump and scream and yell and carry on, but to cry is such a deep emotion that you can't fake it. And when you find this in an entertainer, it means you're going to sell magazines, you're going to sell records, you're going to sell all kinds of things, you're going to have a massive following. The Beatles did it, but most entertainers can't do it. So now he's whispering softly, and now he overshot the mark. I wound up changing my position. I've now got front lighting, and she says to him, Elvis, I'll bet you can't kiss me. Well, he's been trying all day. And meantime, remember, there's a show going on the stage. And the kids are now saying, we want Elvis, we want Elvis. But he's still carrying on in the back. And she finally said, bet you can't kiss me. And she sticks out her tongue a tiny little bit. And he sticks out his tongue, but he overshoots the mark, and he bends her nose. And then he realizes it, and he backs off, and then he comes in a second time for a perfect landing. And it's the classic, iconic shot, which lasted all of 1/10 of a second, and everybody thinks this is the hottest thing since sliced bread. And Diane Keaton, who was the first one to buy this picture, actually bought it from me. She's a photo collector. She asked me whether she could publish it in French Vogue, and she described this picture as the most, this is, I'm having a moment here. She described it as it being the most sensuous. She didn't want to use the word sensuous, but it's even more, what's the word I was looking, huh? Erotic, that's the word. It's the most erotic picture ever taken. And I said, well, if you say so, Diane, I agree with you. All right, so now he's kneeling at the mosque. He's singing down to these people. The mosque was built by the Shriners originally, and then they went bankrupt, and the city of Richmond took over the building. Meantime, he's now heading towards, I have to go fast because I'm getting the hook here. He meets this girl, all dressed in her wedding dress practically, outside the Hudson Theater. He just was very upset reading a story in the newspaper after coming back to New York. He's about to enter the Hudson Theater to do pre-rehearsals and the actual show. And there she is. She just met Elvis, and she breaks down and cries. You see, he makes the girls cry. And she was brought in from Long Island by her father, and now she totally breaks up. And she has white gloves on, so that's important. And meantime, I'm now in the Hudson Theater. Now we're back into the pre-rehearsal. This is June 29th. He's the first to arrive, so it's called First Arrival. He's singing gospel to an upright piano. And later on, the Colonel comes in, and Steve Allen comes in, and Audrey Meadow, Steve Allen's wife, comes in, and the orchestra leader, and the tailor who's going to fit him for his tuxedo. And then Elvis has to go into the closet to take off his pants, put the tuxedo on, and then he's coming out of the closet. So I have pictures of Elvis coming out of the closet, then goes back in the closet. And now we're actually on the show. The curtain divides, the orchestra behind. It's just, and Steve is actually introducing Elvis as the new Elvis Presley. And everybody's hanging around, but that's not what the audience sees. They see what's on the monitor, on that little screen. And here's Imogene Coca in a rehearsal shot with Elvis. And I love this picture. It's a classic kind of show business picture. The dog with the hat and the six-shooter and Steve, and they're blocking out, and the television camera, the lights, and the Greek columns and the musicians. What more can you want to be showbiz? Now we get to rehearsing again with the dog on the pedestal, and girls behind bars. They weren't allowed into the theater because there were too many people already in there, and they're screaming, "Elvis, we love you." Then when he's finished, he comes out, these young, in those days, these young Negro girls, now it's Afro-American girls, they were trying to touch Elvis, and they were as excited about him as the white girls. And then he's leaving, and the New York's finest saying, "No, stand back, don't touch." And here we have Elvis in the recording session. You see, there are two microphones. The upper one is for his voice, and the second one is for the thump. It's "Don't be cruel to a heart that's true. Don't be cruel to a heart that's true." The thumping, the bottom mic is the thump mic, see? And that's because he's hitting the back of the leather guitar. Now this is a simple recording studio, and I took some color, even though I was told not to take color because they weren't going to pay for the cost of developing the color, and what would happen if Elvis disappeared and he wasn't going to become popular? Who's going to use the color of a guy who disappeared? But I shot it anyway, and I have about 120 color shots of him from that period. The Jordanaires and him rehearsing "Don't Be Cruel," and "Any Way You Want Me." This is probably "Any Way You Want Me." Those were the three songs he recorded. He likes what he's hearing, so he's having a bit of exciting moment here. And he was listening to a 14-inch speaker. He's the Buddha now. He's listening intently. Everybody's waiting for him to react. Pennsylvania Station, which unfortunately got ripped down, even though Jackie Onassis Kennedy tried her damnedest to try to preserve the building as a classic building architecture, but Madison Square Garden had to go up, and that's the ground they wanted, and so the building came down. And Elvis is listening on the train to his records that he had recorded 2 days earlier, or 1 day earlier, and these were quick acetate cuts, so he could memorize the way he performed them. We're in Sheffield, Alabama. He's picking up his fried chicken legs and snow cones, and Junior Smith, behind Elvis, is going to pay for all this, and Elvis gets some chocolate milk. Those of you who smoke will recognize the Lucky Strike means fine tobacco package down there, the little square package. And this picture is called No More Paper Towels. And he's finished washing his hands, and then he's going like this. And I would have complained to the management. Of course, that's the way I was brought up. And then he wipes his hands, but not a peep out of him. It was like, well, there's no paper towels, so you could just dry your hands some other way. Some people thought Elvis was gay because he had that sort of limp wrist, but he wasn't, not that I know of. He just was drying his hands. Now, here's an unusual photograph. We're in Chattanooga. He's ordering breakfast because we have to change trains from east to west. I'm getting the high sign, faster, faster. So if I talk at higher speeds, you'll have to understand. And this woman comes into my frame, and then I remember it's a segregated lunch counter. She can't sit down. She wants a tuna fish sandwich. And she can't get the attention of the waitress, and then she gets suspicious of me, and she backs out of the frame. Later on, she got her sandwich, and she ate it out in the other room. Now we're back on the train, Junior Smith and Elvis with his Archie comic book. And these are not great photographs, but they're interesting nevertheless, as Chris Murray, who's the curator, picked these out because this was the last time that it was documented that Elvis could walk on the street without having to have all kinds of bodyguards. He could just walk like you and me. And Little Richard once said, Elvis got what he wanted, but he lost what he had. He got fame and fortune, but he lost his privacy. And that's what happens when you want fame and fortune. So now he's walking along the street at a place called White Station. He meets this colored lady, and she points in that direction to Audubon Drive and where he lived. And he waves to us goodbye. We're now with Elvis Vernon Presley. Vernon Elvis Presley. That's where the name, I think, came from, as father. And they're discussing that hole in the ground where the valve is stuck and the swimming pool will not fill up. So what do? Well, they do it later. In the meantime, we're talking about the eau de cologne that Barbara Hearn just brought Gladys Presley, his mother, who passed away 2 years after this picture was taken at the age of 45. And they filled the pool, at least part of the pool, with a 50-foot water hose from the kitchen sink. It took 6 hours. But they were determined. He was determined. This is Barbara Hearn, his high school sweetheart, at least one of them. And they're listening to the quick acetate cuts. Elvis is about to take a shower. He took a shower. He's sitting there in his... And Ma Presley had this painting done of his first publicity picture, and she had it painted in oil paint and then put a little light around it. She loved that picture. This photograph was not posed, I swear it. The question is, why won't the motorcycle start? The answer is no gas in the tank. You have to put gasoline in the tank or else it won't start. And now he's being escorted into the Rustwood Park by the Shore Patrol from the Navy, by the local police department, and he's on stage in front of 14,000 people. Scotty Moore is over to the right, his guitar player. Some of the other performers are watching, more fans, and this I call Starburst. You need a little bit of luck to be a photographer sometimes. You see that spray that comes out at the top of the picture and that light that went off. Well, lucky me, I framed the image. Elvis is singing. Now somebody in the back gets up. Let's go with a flash bulb, which gives me backlight to all of the people, at least in front of where she was, and lights up, gives me a separation, and sprays me right into the lens. And it does what Kodak says you should never do, which is shine a light right in your lens. But I call it Starburst, and what you see on top is not really in the photograph. It's a reaction in my camera, and you can't see that with your natural eyes. And that, I think, is the end of the story. No, we're back to the beginning. We saw this, didn't we? Yes. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me?
Would you like to have some,
I
ask
think we'd like
questions?
to have some questions.
Yes.
This isn't working, so.
We're open for questions.
Anybody have a question? I think there's bringing some mics around. If you raise your hand, they'll bring a mic right here. In the middle, sir. You stand up and they'll bring you a mic to ask your question. Please wait for the mic.
Mr. Wertheimer, I wanted to comment on your website. I saw it this week, and it's fantastic.
Oh, you saw it?
I did.
Well,
it's very well
you can
done.
thank him for putting it up. He's
Well,
my webmaster.
He's
That's
it.
Spiro.
And I had a question.
Yes.
There was a comment on the website that you had about 2,500 images
Yes,
of
I
Elvis.
do. Yes, I do.
How many would you estimate have never been printed or seen?
About 500.
About 500.
So I would say I have some work to do in my old age.
Yes, you do.
To get
Thank
them
you
out.
very much. It's been very enjoyable.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Anybody else? Right here, yes. Want to stand up, please, and we'll bring you a microphone.
I was just curious, at the Steve Allen show, how did he respond to having to sing to the hound dog?
How did I what?
How did Elvis respond to having to...
Well, actually, very well. I mean, the dog was slobbering all over Elvis, and Elvis bent down, practically kissed the dog. There's a series of about 14 images that I have. I could just do a whole magazine piece on Elvis and the hound dog. And but Elvis knew how to handle the animal. On the one hand, he got close, but he made sure he had his hand around the snout so he wouldn't get bitten. He did it very well. He knew he was being had, but what could he do? He was Elvis Presley. It was the Steve Allen show, not the Elvis Presley show. That's why later on at Westwood Park, he said, tonight you're going to see the real Elvis Presley, not what you saw the other night. And then everybody applauded, and then he gyrated all over the stage, and the girls screamed, and everybody was happy.
Anybody else? Oh, right here, yes, on the end. Just a second, wait for the mic, please.
I was just wondering if he really talked with you much.
Well, you see, I was shy, and he was really shy. And one of my tactics was not to get too involved with the subject, because once you do, then you owe them something. And I didn't want to owe anybody anything. I wanted to be the messenger. Whatever the person is or was, that's what I would record. I was more interested in photographing for 100 years from now, not for an assignment for RCA 3-4 weeks hence. I'm interested, for instance, in Fox Talbert's work, who invented photography back around 1830. So Daguerre's work. These things interest me, Brady's work. So I was sort of out of that school of the historian, dissector of why people do things, and try to be as unintrusive as possible and let just people direct their own life. And what I've noticed is that when people are doing things that are more important in their life than having their picture taken, and you're taking pictures, you're going to get good pictures. But when photography is the most important thing at the moment, you may get some good pictures, but that only depends on how good a director you are and how good an actor these people are that you're trying to direct. But notice the next time when you notice somebody involved in what they're doing, their eyes change. They start to have an inner glow that comes out, where if you say, well, could you just pose? Could you just move a little to the right? They're like mannequins. You're just getting the outer part of them. You're not getting any of the inner part of them. And that's what I noticed from Elvis at looking at my contact sheets over and over and over and many. And right now, I'm in the process, having signed a contract with Taschen Books in Germany. We're coming out with a book with another 100 images that have never been published, 400 maybe in all, and it'll be so heavy most of you won't be able to lift it. It's like when Taschen puts out a book, it's 20 pounds, you know. You need a weightlifter to do it. But anyway, they pay very, very well, and I'm going to be devoting Well, that's not, but they put out a good product. That's the important thing. So they're putting out these 2 collector's editions, and then 2 years from now, it's going to be a trade book, which is going to be a mass distribution. So I'm looking forward to that. That's going to consume the next 4 or 5 months of my life. But I'm still involved with Elvis. Can you imagine? From 1956 till now, that's 50 some odd years. I mean, Elvis has affected me a great deal. I would have had a much different kind of life had Ann Fulchino not called me. I probably would have had a family with 6 kids. And as it is, I didn't. Yeah. Anything else?
Well, thank you again, Mr. Wertheimer, for a great program. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues from the National Archives, the curatorial staff there especially, who worked to bring both of these exhibits together. Thank our special guests from Graceland and Peter Mars and your team. We hope you will all join us downstairs for the reception. We have some nice beverages for you and some, I think, a special Elvis-related snack. And then I believe you're going to sign some copies of your book.
Well, if you have the book,
we have your book.
I'll sign copies.
Museum store if you have copies with you, or you can purchase books. And thanks as well to Mrs. Betty Bumpers for being with us tonight, and Ambassador Mel French is also here. So thank you all for coming. Enjoy your evening, and please enjoy the exhibits.